My name is Ella Allen. I was 34 years old on Christmas Day, and I walked out of Coastal Valley Medical with the kind of exhaustion that makes your bones feel hollow. I had worked a double shift in the medical surgical unit, the place where people land when life falls apart in ordinary, unglamorous ways. I had changed dressings, chased down lab results, calmed a confused grandmother who kept asking for her mother, and watched the clock like it was a lifeline. When I finally stepped into the parking lot, the air hit my face like cold seawater. My scrubs were folded in my tote bag, my hair was still pulled tight from the day, and my hands smelled like sanitizer no matter how hard I rubbed them on my jeans. Christmas lights blinked along the street outside the hospital, cheerful and almost rude, like they had no idea what I had just seen behind those automatic doors. I drove home alone in my old sedan with the heater coughing warm air at my knees. The radio played soft holiday songs, and every chorus sounded like it belonged to another person's life. My phone buzzed with a message from my mother asking if I would be at dinner later. I did not answer. My family claimed they supported me, but their support always carried an edge. My sister Linda liked to remind people that I was only a nurse, as if my job was a lesser version of real medicine. She said it with a laugh, and my father would smile into his drink. I had learned to swallow the hurt because arguing on a holiday never changed anything. The freeway was mostly empty, a dark ribbon curving along the coast. A thin winter mist clung to the windshield, and the wipers made slow, tired arcs. I was 10 minutes from my apartment when I saw the hazard lights. They flashed in a steady pulse on the shoulder, bright against the gray, like a heartbeat refusing to stop. At first, I told myself to keep going. I had been trained to keep going. At the hospital, there was always another patient, another call, light, another need. But then my headlights caught a figure near the driver's door, and my stomach tightened. A woman stood there alone, half turned toward traffic, her arms wrapped around her own chest as cars hissed past. She looked too small for the situation, like a person who had been dropped into the wrong scene. I slowed, then drifted back into my lane, then slowed again. I thought of the older man who had begged me not to leave him earlier, and I thought of my own conscience, loud and simple. I pulled over. The shoulder gravel crunched under my tires. When I stepped out, cold air rushed into my sleeves and stung my knuckles. I kept one hand on my door and called out that I could help. The woman turned into my headlights. She looked mid-50s, mascara smeared under one eye, a coat too thin for the wind. Her fingers shook as she said her name was Marianne. Her car would not start. Her phone was dead. She had no idea where to go. I asked if someone was coming. She swallowed and said her husband had left her after a fight, drove off with the working phone, and told her to figure it out. She said it like she could not believe it on Christmas. I told Marianne to get into my car where it was warm. She hesitated, then climbed into the passenger seat. The heater hit her, and her shoulders dropped. I handed her a spare charger from my glove box and watched the phone wake up. She tried to press money into my palm. I closed her fingers and said no. I told her I was a nurse, that I had just left the hospital, and that I would not leave her alone out there. Her eyes filled with disbelief. I did not know her, but I knew what it feels like to be treated like your work does not count. So I made a simple decision. I would get her somewhere safe, then go home. I believed that was the end of it. I did not know that weeks later my own family would turn on me not because I did something wrong, but because I did something right. I drove to a 24-hour diner with bright windows, and I waited with Marianne until a friend could pick her up. She kept apologizing, and I kept telling her to breathe. Before she left, she touched my wrist and asked for my name again like she needed proof. I said, Ella Allen. She thanked me and walked into the light, and I watched her go, sure the moment would vanish into my busy life. 3 weeks later, my mother would call yelling that I was on television, and my sister would demand what I planned to give them before I finished my coffee. The drive home after I left Marianne at the diner should have been quiet, but my mind refused to slow down. The freeway lights stretched into long, pale lines, and my shoulders ached in that deep way that comes from lifting bodies and holding emotions all day. Being a nurse means carrying other people's fear inside your own chest until you learn how to walk with the weight. That Christmas had been no different. I thought about the patients I had left behind, about the man with pneumonia whose breathing still sounded like gravel, about the young woman crying in the bathroom because she could not afford another day off work. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex, the sky had darkened to a flat winter blue and the air smelled faintly of salt from the ocean. My place was small but clean, a one-bedroom with thin walls and a heater that rattled when it turned on. I kicked off my shoes, peeled off my jacket, and leaned my forehead against the door for a moment, letting the silence wrap around me. Christmas decorations blinked from the neighbors' windows, and somewhere down the hall, a television played a cheerful movie soundtrack. I warmed leftovers and ate standing at the counter, scrolling through messages I had ignored earlier. My mother had sent another text asking if I would come by after all. My sister Linda had sent a photo of her table already set with a caption about how nice it was to have a real holiday. I knew what she meant. Real to Linda meant not working, not coming home tired, not smelling like antiseptic. I typed a response and deleted it twice before saying I would not make it. When I finally sat down on the couch, exhaustion pressed me flat. My thoughts drifted back to Marianne, to the way her hands shook when she held the coffee cup, to the shock in her voice when she realized I was serious about staying with her. Moments like that are common in my line of work, small intersections where someone needs help and you happen to be there. You do not keep score. You do not expect applause. You move on. That was the rule I lived by, especially after years of being reminded by my own family that my job was replaceable, that I was not saving lives in the way doctors did, that nursing was something nice but not impressive. I had learned to measure my worth privately in quiet successes no one else saw. The next few days passed in a blur of shifts and sleep. I worked short-staffed, skipped breaks and took extra hours because someone always called out. Christmas came and went without ceremony. New Year decorations replaced the old lights, and life settled back into routine. If someone had asked me about Marianne, I would have said she was just a stranger I helped once. I did not check the news. I did not think about diner parking lots or broken-down cars. I thought about rent, about my student loans, about whether my back pain meant I needed new shoes again. Then, 3 weeks after Christmas, on a quiet morning before an evening shift, my phone rang. It was my mother, and she never called that early unless something was wrong. Her voice was sharp and breathless, talking over itself as she told me to turn on the television right now. I asked what had happened, but she would not answer, just kept repeating my name like she was afraid I would disappear. I stood in my kitchen with my coffee cooling in my hand and the television flickering to life, unaware that the simple choice I made on the side of the road was about to pull my entire family into a story they believed they were entitled to control. When the television image finally sharpened, I saw a bright studio set dressed in muted winter colors, the kind meant to feel comforting and trustworthy. A local morning show logo glowed in the corner of the screen, and 2 hosts sat angled toward a guest just out of frame. I barely registered them at first because my mother was still talking in my ear, asking if I was sitting down, asking if I was alone. Her voice vibrating with a strange mix of excitement and accusation. Then the camera widened, and I saw the woman seated between the hosts. It took my brain a few seconds to catch up because she looked nothing like the frightened figure from the side of the road. Her hair was styled neatly, her makeup subtle and professional, and she wore a tailored coat draped over the back of the chair like she belonged there. But when she smiled, when she tilted her head as she listened, I recognized her immediately. It was Marianne. My stomach dropped so fast it made me dizzy. The host leaned forward and thanked her for coming on to share a story about kindness during the holidays. Marianne nodded, her hands folded calmly in her lap, and began to speak. She described being stranded on Christmas night after a painful argument, how the cold had crept into her bones, how cars had rushed past without slowing. As she talked, my chest tightened because every detail she mentioned pulled me backward into that moment. She talked about standing alone on the shoulder, about feeling invisible, about wondering if anyone would stop. Then she described a car pulling over a woman stepping out despite the cold, a woman who said she was a nurse and had just finished a long shift. My name was not said yet, but my mother's sharp intake of breath told me she knew. I watched Marianne recount how I had insisted she sit in the warmth, how I had stayed with her, how I had refused money, even when she pressed it into my hand. The hosts exchanged knowing looks, murmuring about how rare that kind of generosity had become. Marianne paused, her eyes shining, and said that the encounter had stayed with her long after that night. She explained that she and her husband had spent weeks trying to find the woman who helped her not to reward her, but to thank her properly. That was when the second host revealed that Marianne and her family were well known in the community for their work with medical charities and hospital foundations. The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt suddenly exposed, like someone had turned a light on without asking. Marianne went on to say that she had learned more about nursing in that 1 hour on the side of the road than she had in years of boardrooms and fundraisers. She spoke about sacrifice, about being on call when everyone else was celebrating, about the quiet strength it takes to show up every day for strangers. My mother made a small, triumphant sound, the kind she usually reserved for gossip, that proved a point. I barely heard her. My attention was locked on the screen as Marianne finished by saying she hoped the woman who helped her was watching and that she wanted her to know how deeply she had been seen. The hosts smiled warmly and said they hoped the mystery nurse would come forward. The segment ended with applause and the show cut to commercial. The kitchen felt too small. My coffee had gone cold and my hands were shaking enough that I set the mug down to keep from spilling it. My phone buzzed immediately with texts from numbers I had not heard from in years. People saying they thought they recognized my voice, my posture, my words. Before I could process any of it, my mother started talking again, this time faster, telling me how proud she was, how she had always known my job mattered, how everyone at church would be talking. Then, without pausing, she asked what the woman on television was planning to do for me and whether I would need help handling the attention. In that moment, as I stood there replaying the image of Marianne in the studio, I felt a new kind of dread settle in. Helping her had felt simple. This did not. I realized with a clarity that made my throat tighten that my family was already rewriting the story, placing themselves at its center, and that whatever came next would not be as uncomplicated as a warm diner and a working phone on Christmas night. After the television segment ended, I stood in my kitchen longer than I should have, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside my window. The moment felt unreal, like I had stepped sideways into someone else's life without permission. I finished my coffee, even though it tasted bitter and cold, then washed the mug and set it in the rack with deliberate care, the way I do when I need my hands to be busy, so my thoughts do not run away from me. Being a nurse trains you for moments like that. You learn how to compartmentalize, how to acknowledge a surge of emotion without letting it knock you over. I told myself nothing had actually changed. I had helped someone. She had spoken about it on television. That was all. I still had an evening shift to get ready for. I still had rent due in 2 weeks and a car that made a whining noise when I turned the wheel too sharply. I still lived alone in a small apartment with secondhand furniture and a closet full of practical shoes. I showered, pulled my hair back, and dressed in clean scrubs, grounding myself in routine. At the hospital, the day moved the way it always did. Call lights blinked. A patient complained about the food. A doctor snapped at me for paging him twice. In the break room, a television played the same morning show on mute captions scrolling along the bottom. I kept my eyes down and focused on my charting. A few coworkers glanced at me with curiosity, but no one said anything yet. It was easier that way. When my shift ended, my phone was full of missed calls. My mother had left 2 voicemails, both breathless and urgent, telling me we needed to talk. My sister Linda had sent a message that simply said, "Call me now." I waited until I was home again, sitting on my couch with my jacket still on, before I returned any of them. My mother answered immediately, her voice warm and overly sweet. She told me she had always defended me, that she had always known my work mattered, that seeing someone say it on television felt like validation. She talked about neighbors stopping her in the grocery store, about how proud my father looked when she told him. I listened quietly, knowing from experience that her pride came with expectations. When she finally paused, I said thank you and told her I was tired. That was when she asked if the woman from the show had contacted me yet. I said no. She sounded disappointed. She said surely there would be some kind of reward, some kind of thank you beyond words. Before I could answer, Linda took the phone. Her tone was sharper, more direct. She said this kind of attention did not come around often and that I needed to be smart about it. She reminded me that our family image mattered, that anything I did would reflect on all of them. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the one that comes when your accomplishments stop belonging to you. I told her I had not done anything for attention, that I was not interested in turning my life into a story for other people to manage. She laughed and said that was easy to say now before the opportunities started knocking. After we hung up, I sat in the dim light of my living room and thought about how quickly the narrative had shifted. At the diner, Mary Ann had been a woman in trouble, and I had been a nurse doing what nurses do. Now, without my consent, I was becoming a symbol, and my family was already positioning themselves around that symbol like it was something to be claimed. I had not asked to be seen. I had not asked to be praised. All I wanted was for things to stay simple. I did not know yet that simplicity was already gone, or that the kindness I had offered freely was about to be weighed, measured, and argued over by the people who had spent years dismissing the value of my work. The days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm that felt both familiar and newly charged. I went to work, charted vitals past medications, and kept my voice steady while inside I carried the awareness that my life had been quietly marked. At the nurse's station, a coworker finally asked if it was me on television. I nodded once and kept typing. She smiled and said it was nice to see a nurse recognized for once. That word once stuck with me. Recognition had never been part of the job, and I had built my sense of worth without it. After my shift, I drove to my parents' house for the first time since Christmas. The driveway was full, even though it was a weekday. When I walked in, the smell of roast chicken and lemon cleaner hit me at the same time, a signal that my mother had been preparing for company. My father sat at the table reading the paper, and Linda stood by the counter scrolling on her phone. They all looked up at once, their expressions brightening in a way that made me feel like I had walked onto a stage. My mother hugged me too tightly and said the neighbors had been asking about me. My father cleared his throat and said it was good to see the family name associated with something positive. Linda set her phone down and said we needed to talk about next steps. I asked what she meant, and she said opportunities like this did not just happen, that people expected a response. She talked about interviews, about community events, about how our family had always believed in service. I almost laughed at that, but I swallowed it down. Service to them had always been something abstract, something to admire from a distance. For me, it was 12-hour shifts and sore feet and holding hands when there was nothing else to offer. I told them I was not interested in turning my job into a performance. My mother frowned and said I was being ungrateful. She reminded me how hard they had worked to raise me, how much they had sacrificed. My father nodded, adding that people would assume the whole family shared in whatever came next. Linda leaned forward and said she had already spoken to a friend who knew a lawyer just in case. That was when the room went quiet. I asked what a lawyer had to do with anything. She shrugged and said it was better to be prepared, that money and attention always complicated things. The word money landed between us like a test. I said there was no money. Not yet. Linda smiled like she knew better. She said there would be, and when it came, it should be handled responsibly. I asked who decided what responsible meant. She said families did. I left not long after, my chest tight and my head pounding. Driving home, I thought about how quickly the story had shifted again. At the hospital, my work was still invisible. At home, it had become leverage. I realized that my family was not interested in what I had done or why. They were interested in what it could become for them. The irony did not escape me. The same people who had spent years minimizing my profession were now eager to claim it when it brought praise. That night, I lay awake listening to my heater rattle and wondered how something that felt so purely right in the moment could turn into something that made me feel so alone. Over the next week, the distance between how my family spoke about me and how they had treated me for years became impossible to ignore. Every phone call carried a new tone, one that slid between praise and pressure so smoothly it left me disoriented. My mother called daily, always starting with how proud she was, how she had told her friends that her daughter worked in healthcare and had a big heart. Then the questions followed. Had I heard from Mary Ann again? Had anyone official reached out? Was there a plan? My father sent articles about community recognition and talked about how respectable it would look if I accepted an award on behalf of the family. Linda was more direct. She texted links to media consultants and said I should consider polishing my image. When I asked what image she meant, she replied that people respected professionals, not just helpers. That line burned more than she knew. I had spent more than a decade building a career grounded in competence and compassion, and now my own sister was reducing it to something decorative. At work, the contrast was sharp. I was still the nurse who got the difficult patients, the one who stayed late when a shift was short, the one who absorbed frustration so others could function. A patient grabbed my hand and thanked me for listening. A doctor walked past without making eye contact. In the break room, someone joked that I should quit and go into television. I smiled thinly and finished my lunch. Nursing teaches you to accept being overlooked, but it does not prepare you for being suddenly visible for the wrong reasons. The real turning point came at a Sunday dinner at my parents' house. Linda had insisted we all sit down together, saying it was important to get on the same page. The table was set carefully, candles lit like it was a holiday instead of an interrogation. Halfway through the meal, Linda cleared her throat and said she had done some thinking. She talked about how families should support each other when opportunities arise, how sacrifices are shared even if the spotlight is not. She listed the ways my parents had helped me over the years, the rent I paid back late, after nursing school, the holidays I missed because of work. Each point was framed as an investment. I felt my stomach twist as she spoke because I could see where she was going. She said that if any financial recognition came from my story, it would be fair to discuss how it was distributed. I put my fork down and asked her to be clear. She said it would not be right for me to make decisions alone, that I owed the family transparency. My mother nodded in agreement, her mouth tight. My father looked at his plate and said nothing. I told them I had not helped Marianne for money. I told them there might never be money. Linda smiled like she was humoring a child. She said intentions did not change outcomes, and outcomes affected everyone. In that moment, I understood something I had avoided for years. My family did not see my work as meaningful unless it produced something they could touch. My long nights, my missed holidays, my quiet resilience had been invisible. Now that my actions had drawn attention from someone with influence, they wanted acclaim. I left the table shaking, my appetite gone. In the car, I cried hard enough that I had to pull over. The betrayal cut deeper than anger. It was the realization that the people who should have protected my boundaries were the first to cross them. As I drove home, I thought about Marianne, about how she had trusted me without knowing who I was. I had not expected gratitude from her. I had expected understanding from my family. Instead, the roles had reversed, and the people who had once dismissed my profession were now ready to weaponize it. 2 weeks passed after the Sunday dinner, and the tension did not ease. It sharpened. Every day felt like waiting for something to break, like the moment before a storm finally decides where to land. I kept my head down at work, volunteering for extra shifts so I would not have to sit alone with my thoughts. The hospital was busy in that grinding winter way, flu cases, filling beds, and tempers running short. I focused on tasks I could control: blood pressure, medication times, charting that had to be precise because mistakes carried consequences. At home, my phone stayed face down on the counter more often than not. Messages from my mother stacked up, alternating between affection and guilt. Linda stopped pretending and sent blunt reminders that we needed to talk about the future. I did not respond. Silence felt like the only boundary I could manage without exploding. Late one afternoon, as I was leaving a patient room, the unit clerk called my name and said I had a call waiting. I almost ignored it. Calls during a shift were rarely good news. When I picked up, a calm, unfamiliar voice introduced herself as someone calling on behalf of Marianne. My pulse jumped so hard I had to lean against the counter. The woman explained that Marianne had been trying to reach me directly, but did not want to intrude. She asked if there was a good time to talk privately. I gave her my number and finished the rest of my shift in a haze, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind raced. I drove home with the radio off, every mile stretching longer than the last. When I walked into my apartment, the light was already fading the sky outside my window, turning that pale gray that always made me feel suspended between day and night. I set my bag down and stood there listening to my own breathing, waiting. The call came 20 minutes later. Marianne's voice was warm and careful, like she was approaching something fragile. She thanked me again, not in the public way she had on television, but quietly, personally. She said she hoped the attention had not caused me trouble. I hesitated, then told her the truth, that my family was struggling with it. She sighed softly and said she was not surprised. She told me that generosity often revealed more about the people watching than the people receiving it. She said she wanted to meet in person somewhere neutral to talk without cameras or expectations. I agreed, my throat tight with a mix of relief and apprehension. After we hung up, I sat on my couch staring at the blank screen of my phone. Part of me was grateful beyond words that she had reached out with such consideration. Another part of me was afraid of what her involvement might escalate. I knew my family would see her as an opportunity, not a person. As if on cue, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was Linda, her message short and sharp, asking if I had heard anything new. I did not reply. I thought about the woman on the side of the road, about the trust she had placed in me when I was a stranger. I thought about how that trust had cost me peace. I also thought about how avoiding conflict had cost me something too. By the time I went to bed that night, I knew that whatever happened next, I could not keep pretending this would resolve itself quietly. Something had been set in motion weeks ago on the shoulder of a dark freeway, and it was still moving, gathering weight. I did not yet know how it would land, but I could feel the impact coming, and I understood that the next choices I made would decide whether I stayed a bystander in my own life or finally stepped into it with intention. I met Marianne 3 days later at a quiet cafe near the marina, the kind of place with wide windows and soft music that encouraged people to linger. I arrived early, ordered tea, and chose a table near the back where conversations blended into a low, harmless murmur. My nerves hummed beneath my calm exterior, the same way they do before delivering bad news to a family in a hospital room. When Marianne walked in, I recognized her immediately, even without the polished studio lighting. She wore a simple sweater and slacks, her hair pulled back loosely, and she scanned the room with the careful awareness of someone used to being seen. Her face softened when she spotted me. She smiled and came over, taking my hands briefly in hers before sitting down. The gesture was warm grounding, and it reminded me again of the night we first met, when she had looked at me with the same mixture of relief and disbelief. We talked for a few minutes about ordinary things about the weather, about how busy the cafe was easing into the conversation like people testing water temperature before stepping in. Then Marianne's expression grew more serious. She told me she had been thinking a great deal about our encounter and about the response that followed. She said she never intended to put me in a position where my private life would be pulled apart. I believed her. There was no performance in her voice, no trace of entitlement. She explained that her family had built much of their philanthropic work around healthcare because of experiences they had faced personally, and that seeing a nurse step in without hesitation had affected her deeply. She paused, then said she wanted to do something tangible, something that acknowledged not just kindness, but sacrifice. She slid an envelope across the table toward me, not dramatically, but with quiet intention. I did not touch it at first. My heart thudded as if it already knew what was inside. I told her I had not helped her for anything in return. She nodded and said she knew that, which was why she was offering it anyway. She said gratitude was not a transaction, but a responsibility. When I finally opened the envelope, my breath caught. Inside was a letter and a check for $30,000. The number felt unreal heavy with implication. My first instinct was to push it back toward her. I told her I could not accept it, that it would complicate things. She listened without interrupting, then spoke gently but firmly. She said she understood complications better than most, and that refusing would not undo the attention, but accepting could give me choices I had been postponing for years. She mentioned continuing education rest security. She did not mention my family, but the word hung between us anyway. I stared down at the check and thought about my loan statements, about the ache in my back at the end of every shift, about the nights I lay awake calculating expenses instead of dreaming. I also thought about Linda's expectant smile, my mother's sudden pride, and the way money had already twisted their concern into something sharp. Tears blurred my vision as I told Marianne I was afraid of what accepting would unleash. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand again. She said generosity often attracts greed, but that did not mean the generosity was wrong. She told me I did not owe anyone access to my life simply because someone had shown appreciation for my work. Her words landed with a weight that felt different from my family's demands. After a long silence, I nodded. I accepted the envelope not with excitement, but with resolve. We talked a little longer about boundaries, about the importance of protecting what mattered. When we stood to leave, Marianne hugged me briefly and said she hoped this would be the beginning of something supportive, not destructive. I watched her walk away, the envelope tucked securely in my bag, and felt a strange mix of gratitude and foreboding settle in my chest. I knew, even as I stepped back into the bright afternoon light, that the real conflict had not been avoided, it had only been delayed. The moment I walked back into my apartment, the envelope felt heavier than it had at the cafe, as if the quiet walls themselves understood what it represented. I set my bag down carefully, like it contained something fragile, and sat at the small kitchen table, staring at the wood grain until my breathing slowed. Accepting the check did not feel like winning anything. It felt like stepping onto a path I could no longer step off. I folded the letter Marianne had written and read it again, absorbing the careful language she used, the way she framed the money not as a reward but as acknowledgement of work that too often went unseen. That night, sleep came in short, uneven stretches. Every time I drifted off, my mind pulled me back with images of my family's faces, of Linda's calculating calm, of my mother's sudden warmth that never came without strings. By morning, my phone had already started buzzing. The news segment had been shared again, clipped and reposted with captions praising kindness, praising nurses, praising the spirit of the season long after Christmas had passed. I muted notifications and went to work, telling myself I would handle one thing at a time. At the hospital, whispers followed me down the hall. A supervisor pulled me aside and said administration was proud that positive attention was good for the institution. She suggested I consider speaking at a community event. I thanked her and said I would think about it, my stomach tightening at the idea of more eyes, more expectations. During lunch, I checked my voicemail. There were 3 messages from my mother and 1 from my father, his voice unusually tense. He said we needed to talk as a family, that things were getting complicated, and it was better to address them head on. I knew what that meant. They knew. Somehow, even without me telling them, they knew there was money involved. The thought made my chest ache. I finished my shift in a fog and drove straight to my parents' house, deciding it was better to face whatever was coming before it grew teeth. When I walked in, Linda was already there, sitting at the table with her laptop open like she had come prepared. My mother stood by the counter pretending to tidy, and my father paced near the window. The air felt tight, charged. No one offered me food or asked about my day. Linda gestured for me to sit. She did not waste time. She said she had heard through community contacts that Marianne had made a private gesture of appreciation. She said she hoped I had been honest with them. I felt a flicker of anger, sharp and unexpected. I told her my finances were not her business. My mother stepped in, then her voice trembling as she said families shared burdens and benefits alike. She said secrecy bred resentment. My father stopped pacing and said he just wanted to make sure I did not make a mistake that could hurt everyone. The word everyone hung in the air, heavy with implication. I realized then that this was no longer about pride or recognition. It was about control. I told them I had accepted a gift, that it was mine, and that I planned to use it responsibly. Linda's expression hardened. She said that was exactly what she was afraid of, that I did not understand the larger picture. She said money changed dynamics, and that if I insisted on handling it alone, she would have to protect the family's interests. I asked her what that meant. She closed her laptop slowly and said it meant getting advice just to be safe. In that moment, as I looked at the people who had raised me, who had watched me work myself to exhaustion without comment, I felt something shift. The story they were telling about me no longer included trust, and I knew with a sinking certainty that whatever came next would not be resolved with another calm conversation. I left my parents' house that night with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, the streetlights blurring as tears gathered in my eyes. The drive home felt longer than usual, every red light another chance for the conversation to replay in my head. I had expected disappointment, maybe even anger, but I had not expected the cold calculation in Linda's voice, the way she spoke about protection as if I were a liability instead of a sister. When I got home, I did not turn on any lights. I sat in the dark living room listening to my own breathing, feeling the weight of a truth I could no longer avoid. My family did not see me as an individual with boundaries. They saw me as an extension of themselves, useful only when I produced something they could claim. The next morning, I woke with a tight knot in my stomach and the familiar dread of an upcoming shift. Work had always been my refuge, a place where effort mattered more than appearances, but even that felt compromised now. Halfway through the day, my phone buzzed in my locker. During my break, I checked it and saw a message from Linda that made my heart drop. She said she had scheduled a consultation with a lawyer not to attack me, she claimed, but to clarify rights and obligations before things became messy. The implication was clear. If I did not cooperate, she would escalate. I sat there staring at the screen, the hum of the vending machine loud in the small break room, and felt a wave of disbelief wash over me. This was the same sister who had rolled her eyes when I missed holidays, who had joked about my scrubs like they were a costume. Now she was talking about obligations. I finished my shift in a haze, going through the motions with practiced precision, while my mind raced ahead to worst-case scenarios. That evening, an email arrived from an unfamiliar law firm. The subject line mentioned family representation. My hands went cold as I opened it. The message was polite, almost friendly, requesting a discussion regarding recent financial developments connected to public recognition. They framed it as a preventative measure, a way to ensure transparency and fairness. Reading between the lines did not require much imagination. They were laying the groundwork to challenge my control over the money, to frame my acceptance of it as something that involved the family by default. I felt violated in a way that was hard to articulate. My kindness had been turned into leverage, my profession into a bargaining chip. I called Marianne that night, my voice unsteady, as I explained what was happening. She listened quietly, then told me not to respond to anything yet. She said this was exactly why she had hesitated before making the offer, because she had seen how quickly generosity could attract entitlement. She told me she would connect me with someone she trusted, someone who understood both law and discretion. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table long after the clock crept past midnight. I thought about how easy it would have been to avoid all of this by driving past that stranded car, by choosing exhaustion over empathy. But regret did not come. What came instead was a hardening resolve. I had spent my adult life advocating for patients who could not speak for themselves. I knew how to stand firm when something was right, and as frightening as it was to realize my own family was now on the opposite side of that line, I understood that this was a moment that would define more than just my finances. It would define whether I was willing to protect my own dignity with the same determination I offered strangers. The lawyer Marianne connected me with was named Daniel Harper, and he called the next afternoon with a voice so calm it immediately slowed my breathing. He did not rush, did not interrupt, and did not sound impressed by the television segment or alarmed by my family's threats. He asked simple questions and listened carefully to my answers, the way good clinicians do when they are trying to understand a whole picture instead of just one symptom. When I finished explaining everything, he said something that surprised me. He said the situation was not as complicated as my family wanted it to be. He explained that the money Marianne gave me was a personal gift offered privately with no contractual obligation and no shared ownership. He said public praise did not create family entitlement, no matter how loudly someone insisted otherwise. Hearing that felt like unclenching a fist I had been holding tight for weeks. He told me the reason people like my sister relied on intimidation was because intimidation often worked. Most people folded before they ever reached a courtroom. He said my best protection would be clarity, documentation, and boundaries. He asked if I was willing to let him respond on my behalf. I said yes without hesitation. For the first time since Christmas, I felt like I was not facing this alone. That evening, I drafted a short email to my family saying I had sought legal advice and that any further communication about the money should go through my attorney. My hands shook as I pressed send, but the relief that followed was immediate. The next morning, my mother called repeatedly. I did not answer. Linda sent a long message accusing me of escalating things unnecessarily, of choosing outsiders over blood. I forwarded it to Daniel and went to work. At the hospital, life continued with its usual urgency. A patient coded unexpectedly, and the team moved as one, focused and efficient. As I pressed on a chest and called out numbers, I thought about how strange it was that I felt more supported in moments of crisis by colleagues than by my own family. After the shift, Daniel called to say he had responded formally to the law firm Linda contacted. He told me the message was clear and final. Any attempt to claim a portion of the gift would be contested aggressively. He added that pursuing it could expose my family to reputational consequences they likely had not considered. That detail mattered more than the legal language. 2 days later, the tone shifted. My father left a voicemail that sounded tired rather than angry. He said he wanted peace, that maybe things had gone too far. My mother sent a message saying she missed me. Linda went silent. The absence of pressure felt almost eerie. I met Marianne again briefly to thank her for connecting me with Daniel. She listened as I explained what had happened, her expression tight with anger that softened into something like sadness. She said it hurt to see kindness turned into conflict, especially by people who should have protected me. She told me she was proud of how I handled it, not because I fought back, but because I did not surrender myself to keep others comfortable. That distinction mattered. As the weeks passed, the noise faded. No lawsuit materialized, no further demands arrived. The money sat in my account untouched while I decided what to do with it on my own timeline. The attention from the media dwindled, replaced by new stories and new faces. At work, I was still a nurse. Patients still needed me. That constancy steadied me. What changed was something internal. I stopped apologizing for drawing lines. I stopped explaining my choices to people who had already decided how they felt. I understood now that doing the right thing did not guarantee an easy outcome, but it did guarantee self-respect. And as much as my family tried to turn my compassion into a weakness, the truth was simpler and stronger. The night I stopped on the side of the road, I acted according to my values. Everything that followed only proved how necessary those values were. The silence from Linda did not last as long as I hoped it would. About a week after Daniel sent his response, I came home from work to find a thick envelope slipped under my apartment door. My name was typed neatly on the front, my full legal name, the way people use when they want to remind you that things are serious now. I stood there in the hallway longer than necessary, listening to a neighbor's television through the wall, bracing myself before picking it up. Inside was not a lawsuit, not yet, but something more insidious. A letter written in careful, restrained language that framed concern as responsibility and pressure as love. Linda claimed she was acting out of fear, that I was being manipulated by wealthy strangers, that I did not understand the implications of accepting such a gift, that the family had a moral obligation to intervene before I damaged my own future. She referenced my long hours, my exhaustion, my tendency to put others first, as if those traits proved I could not be trusted to advocate for myself. Reading it made my hands tremble with a mixture of anger and grief. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate attempt to rewrite my character in a way that justified control. That night, I slept poorly, my mind replaying old memories through a new lens. Linda dismissing my schedule because she assumed nursing was flexible. My parents joking that I chose a safe job instead of an ambitious one. Every small comment I had brushed aside now lined up into a pattern that was impossible to ignore. The next day, my mother showed up unannounced at my apartment. She stood in the doorway, clutching her purse, her eyes shiny, and said she was worried about me. She said Linda was only trying to protect me, that families stepped in when someone lost perspective. I asked her quietly when they had ever stepped in to protect me before. She did not answer. Instead, she told me I was being stubborn, that pride was clouding my judgment. She said people were talking, that some thought I was letting the attention go to my head. That was the moment something in me went still. I realized they were not afraid I would fail. They were afraid I would succeed without them. I told my mother I loved her, but that I would not discuss the money or my choices again. She cried, accused me of shutting them out, and left. Later that evening, Daniel called to check in. I told him about the letter and the visit. He was not surprised. He said this was a common escalation when legal pressure failed an attempt to regain control through emotional leverage. He advised me to document everything and maintain distance. Hanging up, I felt a deep sadness settle over me, heavier than the fear had been. I had always believed family conflict could be resolved if you just tried harder to understand each other. Now, I understood something harder. Sometimes understanding only gave manipulators better tools. Over the next few days, rumors began to reach me through indirect channels. An aunt messaged asking if I was all right, mentioning that she had heard I was being taken advantage of. A cousin hinted that the family was worried about my stability. The narrative was spreading, and it was not one I recognized. I kept going to work, kept caring for patients, kept showing up because that was who I was. But inside, a line was being drawn. I was no longer willing to sacrifice my sense of self to maintain an illusion of harmony. Helping Mary Ann had exposed a truth I could not unsee. My family respected control more than compassion appearances, more than integrity. And if standing by my values meant being cast as the problem, then I would accept that role rather than surrender the one thing they could not take from me. The formal notice arrived on a Thursday afternoon, slipped into my mailbox between grocery flyers and a water bill. I recognized the return address immediately, the same law firm name Linda had mentioned weeks earlier, now printed in bold, like it carried authority by itself. I stood in the stairwell with the envelope resting against my palm, feeling a slow burn rise behind my ribs. When I opened it inside my apartment, the language was polished and restrained, the kind that pretends to be reasonable while sharpening the blade. The letter stated that my sister, acting in the interest of family unity, was requesting disclosure related to a financial gift received following public recognition, asserting that the circumstances created shared reputational value and therefore shared interest. It suggested mediation, first litigation, second, and framed both as protective measures. I read it twice, then a third time, letting the meaning sink in. They were not asking, they were positioning. They were turning my kindness into a commodity and my profession into a justification. My phone rang as if on cue. It was Linda. I did not answer. She left a message anyway, her voice measured and disappointed, saying this did not have to get ugly if I would just be reasonable. Reasonable in her mouth meant compliant. I forwarded the letter to Daniel and sat on the edge of my couch, staring at the scuffed floor. A memory surfaced without warning of a holiday years earlier when Linda had joked in front of friends that I was the safe one, the one who would never rock the boat. At the time, I had smiled. Now I understood the cost of that label. Daniel called within the hour. His tone was steady but firm. He said the letter was an intimidation tactic dressed as mediation, and that responding directly would only feed it. He explained our next steps, clearly outlining how he would rebut the claims and warn of consequences if they persisted. As he spoke, I felt something unexpected take shape beneath the fear. Anger, yes, but also clarity. This was no longer about misunderstanding. This was about power. That evening, my parents called together. My father spoke first, his voice heavy, saying he was disappointed it had come to this. My mother added that Linda was only trying to keep the family from fracturing. I asked them why keeping the family together required taking something that did not belong to them. There was a long pause. My father said families made sacrifices for each other. I replied that I had been making sacrifices for years quietly without asking for credit or compensation. I told them I would not sacrifice my autonomy now to preserve an image that only benefited others. My mother cried. My father said we would regret this distance. I said distance was sometimes the only way to stop harm. After the call, I walked outside and stood on the small balcony, letting the cool air clear my head. The city hummed below, indifferent to my family drama, and that indifference steadied me. The next day at work, I moved through my shift with a focused calm that surprised me. A patient thanked me for explaining a procedure carefully. Another squeezed my hand and said I made her feel safe. Those moments mattered more than any letterhead ever could. When Daniel confirmed he had sent a formal response rejecting mediation and warning against further action, I felt a strange relief, like exhaling after holding my breath too long. I knew the response might provoke another move. I also knew I was done bending. My family had chosen their side, and I had chosen mine. The cost was painful, but the alternative was losing myself, and that finally was a price I refused to pay. The response Daniel sent did not end the conflict, but it changed its shape. For several days, nothing happened at all, and the quiet felt deceptive, like the pause before someone decides their next move. I went to work, came home, cooked simple meals, and waited. Then the next letter arrived, this one thinner, more aggressive in tone, despite its careful phrasing. It claimed emotional harm, reputational confusion, and the need to protect vulnerable family members from decisions made under pressure. Reading it, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with fear. They were trying to paint me as unstable as someone whose profession and exhaustion made her susceptible to influence. The implication was clear. If they could not take the money outright, they would undermine my credibility. I forwarded the letter to Daniel and sat quietly, letting the anger pass through me without taking over. He called later and explained that this was the moment where bluster often gave way to consequences. He said we would answer once more firmly and then let their own choices determine what followed. That night, I barely slept, not because I doubted myself, but because I was grieving something I had not realized I still hoped for. I had wanted my family to stop, to recognize the line they were crossing and step back. Instead, they were doubling down. The next morning, Daniel sent their attorney a detailed response that dismantled every claim point by point. He cited the lack of any legal nexus, the private nature of the gift, and the risk of defamation if they continued to suggest impairment or manipulation without evidence. He also attached a notice of intent to seek costs and damages if harassment persisted. The language was professional, restrained, and unmistakably serious. Within hours, my phone rang. It was my father. His voice sounded older than it had the week before. He said Linda was upset that she felt blindsided by the strength of the response. He asked if there was any way to de-escalate any compromise that would save face. I told him calmly that de-escalation had always been available, but it required respecting my boundaries. He sighed and said Linda believed I had changed, that money had made me cold. I told him the truth, that the only thing that had changed was my willingness to be dismissed. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and thought about how easily my sacrifices had been reframed as liabilities. At the hospital, my work continued without ceremony. I covered a double shift when a coworker called out sick. I listened to a patient describe her fear of going home alone. I advocated for a man whose pain was being minimized. Each act reminded me why I chose this profession in the first place. It was not for recognition. It was for dignity, mine and others. 2 days later, Daniel called again, this time with a note of finality. The opposing counsel had withdrawn their demands. No mediation, no litigation, no further contact. The reason, he explained, was not kindness or reflection. It was risk. They had consulted further and realized how exposed they would be if the narrative they were pushing came under scrutiny. The relief I felt was real, but it was tempered by sadness. The conflict had ended not because my family understood, but because they were afraid of losing more than they could gain. That evening, my mother left a voicemail saying she hoped we could move forward and put this behind us. She did not apologize. She did not acknowledge the harm. I did not call back. I understood then that closure does not always come with reconciliation. Sometimes it comes with acceptance. I accepted that my family had shown me who they were when my values conflicted with their interests. I accepted that protecting myself was not an act of cruelty, but of care. And as I placed my phone face down and sat in the quiet, I felt a steadiness I had not known before. The storm had passed, not leaving everything intact, but leaving me standing. The days after the withdrawal felt strangely empty, like walking out of an emergency room after a long code and realizing the hallway is quiet again. My body stayed tense out of habit, waiting for another letter, another call, another demand. None came. Instead, there was a silence that forced me to sit with what had happened and what it had cost. I went to work and did my job, but the familiar routines no longer distracted me the way they used to. In the supply room, folding gauze with practiced hands, I caught myself thinking about how easily my family had questioned my judgment while trusting strangers with louder voices and better suits. The realization settled slowly, and then all at once. They had never doubted my competence at work because they respected nursing. They doubted it because respecting me would have meant letting go of control. One evening, I received an email from the hospital administration thanking me again for representing the values of the profession. They asked if I would consider mentoring new nurses or speaking at an orientation. I read the message twice and felt a small, steady warmth spread through my chest. This was different from the attention my family craved. This was grounded in understanding the work, the long hours, the emotional labor. I agreed to help with mentoring not because it made me visible, but because it felt aligned with who I was. At home, I finally decided what to do with the money. I paid down a portion of my loans enough to ease the monthly pressure without erasing the sense of responsibility that kept me careful. I set aside a modest emergency fund. The rest I left untouched, letting it sit as a reminder that security did not have to come at the cost of my integrity. I did not tell my family any of this. I no longer felt the need to justify my choices. A week later, Marianne invited me to lunch again, this time with her husband, a quiet man who listened more than he spoke. We met at a small place overlooking the water sunlight flashing across the surface like scattered coins. They thanked me again, but this time the conversation moved forward instead of circling the past. They asked about my work, my goals, the parts of nursing that drained me, and the parts that still felt worth it. When I spoke about exhaustion, about being overlooked, Marianne nodded with recognition. She said the system relied on people like me to hold it together without ever acknowledging the cost. Hearing that from someone with influence mattered. It did not erase the pain with my family, but it reframed it. Later that night, my father sent a brief message saying he hoped I was well. It was neutral, careful, as if written with a ruler. I replied politely and nothing more. There was no confrontation, no resolution, just a new boundary settling into place. I understood then that reconciliation required accountability, and accountability was something my family was not ready to offer. That realization hurt, but it also freed me. I stopped checking my phone with dread. I slept through the night without replaying conversations. The knot in my stomach loosened. I began to trust that I could build a life rooted in my values, even if that meant building it with fewer people than I once expected. Helping Marianne had not changed who I was. It had revealed it. And losing the illusion of unconditional family support, painful as it was, made room for something steadier to grow. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected happened. The absence of conflict created space, and in that space, new possibilities quietly took shape. Marianne called one afternoon and asked if I had ever considered advancing my credentials. She did not frame it as an offer or a favor, only as a question asked with genuine curiosity. I told her I had thought about it for years, but had always pushed the idea aside because of cost, time, and exhaustion. Nursing had taught me how to endure, not how to plan for myself. She listened, then said she knew administrators at several teaching hospitals and foundations that supported continuing education for nurses, particularly those who stayed in patient-facing roles. She said she would be happy to make introductions if I wanted them with no expectations attached. The distinction mattered. I agreed to talk nothing more. A week later, I found myself sitting in a quiet office across from a program director who spoke respectfully about my experience, my judgment, and the value of nurses who understood systems from the inside. There was no spectacle, no publicity, just a serious conversation about growth. For the first time, I felt seen for the work I actually did, not for the story attached to it. At the same time, Daniel checked in to confirm there had been no further contact from my family. He suggested we keep a light monitoring file for a few months, then close it if the silence held. The matter was resolved, he said, not because feelings had healed, but because the law had drawn a clear line. That clarity brought an unexpected calm. I was no longer bracing for impact. I was moving forward. At the hospital, I began mentoring 2 new nurses, both overwhelmed and eager in equal measure. I told them the truth about the job, about how pride and invisibility often coexist, about the importance of boundaries. As I spoke, I realized I was giving advice I had never allowed myself to follow. My family remained distant. Holidays came and went without invitations. When my mother sent a brief message wishing me well, I replied kindly but kept my footing. There was sadness in that restraint, but also dignity. One evening, as I walked along the marina after a long shift, I thought back to the woman on the side of the road and the simple choice to stop. That choice had exposed fault lines I could not ignore, but it had also connected me to people who understood respect without entitlement. Justice had not arrived with a gavel or a headline. It had arrived quietly through boundaries held and support offered without strings. I understood then that fairness was not about making everyone happy. It was about protecting what was right. As the sun dipped below the water, I felt a sense of steadiness settle in. My life was not suddenly easy, but it was honest. I had not traded one kind of control for another. I had chosen myself, and that choice once made began to echo forward, shaping a future that felt earned rather than claimed. When Marianne called again a few days later, her voice carried a quiet intensity I had not heard before. She told me she had been thinking about everything that had happened, not just to me, but to the idea of kindness itself. She said she could not stop replaying the way my family tried to turn a simple act into leverage and how familiar that pattern felt to her. She explained that over the years, she and her husband had seen generosity exploited in boardrooms and charities, twisted by people who believed proximity entitled them to control. Hearing that made something in my chest tighten because it confirmed what I had felt but struggled to name. This was not personal failure. It was a predictable response to boundaries. Mary Ann said she did not want my story to end with quiet damage hidden behind polite silence. She asked if I would allow her to take a more active role, not publicly, but strategically. She explained that she had already spoken to her legal counsel, the same team that protected her foundation from misuse, and that they were prepared to intervene if my family attempted anything further. I hesitated not because I doubted her intentions, but because I was tired of escalation. She sensed it immediately and slowed her tone. She said this was not about punishment. It was about prevention and accountability. She said people who weaponize family loyalty often rely on the belief that their targets will stay quiet to preserve appearances. The most effective response, she explained, was not anger, but structure. That word stayed with me. Structure. In nursing, structure saves lives. Protocols exist not to limit compassion, but to support it. I agreed to let her proceed. 2 days later, Daniel called to walk me through what would happen next. Mary Ann's legal team had sent a formal notice to my family's attorney outlining the facts, reaffirming the private nature of the gift and warning that any continued attempts to claim entitlement would trigger a counterclaim for harassment and reputational harm. The language was firm, unmistakable, and backed by resources my family did not have. Daniel explained that this kind of intervention changed the risk calculation immediately. It shifted the narrative from emotional dispute to legal exposure. I did not feel triumph when he finished explaining. I felt relief, and beneath it, a deep sadness that it had come to this. That evening, my phone rang. It was my father. His voice was strained, stripped of authority. He said Linda was furious that she felt humiliated that she believed Mary Ann was overstepping. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I said calmly that none of this would have been necessary if my boundaries had been respected from the beginning. He said he did not recognize this version of me. I replied that this version of me had always existed, but it had taken pressure to make her visible. The call ended without resolution. The next day, Linda sent a message so sharp it almost felt rehearsed. She accused me of bringing outsiders into family matters, of embarrassing her, of choosing wealth over loyalty. I read it once and forwarded it to Daniel. I did not respond. Within 48 hours, the tone shifted again. A short email arrived from the law firm stating they were withdrawing all inquiries and advising no further contact. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of harm, only retreat. Daniel confirmed it was over. The threat had collapsed under its own weight. I sat alone at my kitchen table after that call, hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone untouched. I expected to feel victorious. Instead, I felt clear. Justice had not come in the form of vindication or restored relationships. It had come as protection. My family had been stopped, not persuaded. The distinction mattered. I thought about the patients I had seen who only accepted boundaries once consequences became real, and I understood that this was no different. Some people do not respond to explanations. They respond to limits. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in months, not because everything was fixed, but because the danger had passed. In choosing to protect myself with structure and support, I had not abandoned compassion. I had preserved it. The fallout came quietly, not with shouting or dramatic confrontations, but with small signals that told me everything I needed to know. An aunt who had once forwarded rumors sent a brief message apologizing for repeating things she had not verified. A cousin removed a vague post about family loyalty that had clearly been aimed at me. Linda stopped posting entirely for a while, retreating from the confidence she usually projected. My parents did not call. The silence felt different now, no longer threatening, but resigned. At work, life went on with its steady urgency. A patient coded unexpectedly, and I found myself leading compressions until the physician arrived, my voice clear and controlled as numbers were called out. In moments like that, there is no room for doubt. You act because it is right, because training and instinct align. Later, as I washed my hands at the sink, I realized how much easier it was to trust myself in crisis than in family dynamics. The hospital recognized my leadership that day, not publicly, but in a quiet note from my supervisor thanking me for stepping up. That mattered more than any apology I would never receive. A few days later, Daniel called to confirm all files were closed. He advised me to keep records, but to move forward. He said I had handled the situation with restraint, something many people struggled to do when emotions ran high. I thanked him and meant it. The justice in my case had not been theatrical. It had been procedural, effective, and final. That was enough. I met Marianne once more briefly to return a book she had lent me about resilience in caregiving professions. We talked about ordinary things about schedules and weather and the small adjustments that make life easier. She did not ask about my family, and I did not offer. As we parted, she said she hoped the experience had not made me less willing to help others. I told her the truth. It had made me wiser, not colder. Helping someone did not require surrendering myself to those who misunderstood it. That distinction felt important. At home, I reorganized my space donating items I no longer needed, creating room for a future that felt intentional. I enrolled in a prerequisite course for advanced nursing, something I had postponed for years. The commitment was modest, but the decision felt profound. I was investing in myself without seeking permission. When my mother finally called weeks later, her voice was careful. She asked how I was doing. I told her I was well. She said she hoped we could all move past what happened. I replied that moving past it required honesty and respect. She did not argue. We ended the call politely with an understanding that things were changed. That night, I sat by the window watching cars pass, thinking about how the story others tried to tell about me had fallen apart when confronted with facts and boundaries. The villainy had not been dramatic, but it had been real, rooted in entitlement and dismissal. The consequences were equally real, measured not in punishment, but in loss of access. I had not set out to teach anyone a lesson. I had set out to help someone on a dark road. What followed had taught me one instead. Justice does not always restore what is broken. Sometimes it simply stops the breaking. With the legal threat gone, I began to notice the quieter consequences settling into place, the kind that do not announce themselves but alter the shape of daily life. My family did not erupt or apologize or demand reconciliation. They adjusted. Invitations stopped arriving. Group texts went dormant. The space where constant pressure had lived was replaced by a cautious distance that felt both sad and necessary. At first, the absence hurt more than the conflict had. There is a particular ache that comes from realizing you were valued more for what you provided than for who you were. I grieved that loss privately during long walks after work and while folding laundry late at night. But grief slowly made room for something steadier. I noticed how much energy I had been spending anticipating reactions, editing myself, softening truths to keep the peace. Without that constant vigilance, my days felt lighter. At the hospital, I was asked to take on a small leadership role coordinating patient transitions work that required trust and judgment. I accepted without hesitation. The responsibility suited me. It reminded me that competence is not loud and authority does not need to dominate to be real. Patients responded to clarity and kindness, not titles. That understanding carried over into the rest of my life. When acquaintances asked about my family with curiosity edged in gossip, I answered simply that we were giving each other space. I did not defend or accuse. I refused to perform pain for anyone else. One afternoon, I received a message from Linda after weeks of silence. It was brief and carefully worded, saying she hoped I was well and that perhaps time would soften things. There was no acknowledgement of harm, no accountability, only an invitation to forget. I read it twice and felt a calm settle over me. Forgetting had always been the expectation placed on me. This time, I chose memory instead. I replied kindly but firmly that space was helping me and that I wished her well. The exchange ended there. That boundary held. In the evenings, I began studying for my course, spreading textbooks across the kitchen table, relearning how to think about my future beyond survival. The work was demanding, but it felt purposeful. I was not chasing validation. I was building stability. Marianne checked in once, not to offer anything but to ask how I was doing. I told her the truth, that things were quieter and clearer. She said that sounded like progress. I agreed. As weeks passed, the story that had once consumed my thoughts receded into the background. It did not disappear, but it no longer defined me. What remained was a sharper sense of self-respect. I understood now that sacrifice without boundaries invites exploitation, and that compassion without structure can be mistaken for permission. Those lessons were not comfortable, but they were durable. On a Sunday morning, as I prepared for another shift, I caught my reflection in the mirror and saw someone steadier than before. The woman looking back at me had not hardened. She had clarified. She knew what she stood for and what she would no longer tolerate. Helping Marianne had been an instinctive act rooted in care. Protecting myself afterward had been a deliberate act rooted in dignity. Both were necessary. As I locked my door and headed out into the day, I felt grounded in a way I never had before. The chaos had stripped away illusions and left me with something honest. I was no longer the safe one who absorbed impact so others could remain comfortable. I was a professional, a caregiver, and a person with limits. That truth would guide me forward quietly, reliably into a life that belonged to me. The decision to move forward became real the day I received the acceptance email for the advanced nursing program. It arrived quietly without fanfare while I was charting at the nurses' station, and I read it twice to make sure I was not imagining the words. The program offered flexible scheduling, a partial scholarship funded through a health foundation, and mentorship placements that recognized bedside experience as an asset rather than a limitation. I felt a swell of pride that had nothing to do with public praise and everything to do with earned progress. I told my supervisor later that afternoon, expecting a polite congratulations. Instead, she smiled and said she had been waiting for me to take this step, that the unit needed leaders who understood the floor because they lived on it. That validation settled deep. I spent the next weeks rearranging my life in small, practical ways. I adjusted my shift set study hours and learned to say no to overtime without guilt. The money Marianne had given me became a tool rather than a temptation. I allocated it carefully, tuition first, then a modest cushion that allowed me to breathe when unexpected expenses appeared. I did not announce these choices. I did not ask for approval. I acted. The hospital began involving me in transition planning meetings, trusting my assessments and judgment. Doctors asked for my input. New nurses sought advice. None of it felt sudden. It felt like alignment, the natural outcome of standing in my worth without apology. Marianne and her husband invited me to dinner one evening at their home, a simple meal with conversation that flowed easily. They asked about my studies and listened without interrupting their interest focused on my goals rather than the story that once surrounded me. At one point, Marianne said something that stayed with me. She said that generosity should expand a person's choices, not narrow them. I realized then how different that philosophy was from the one my family had shown, where gifts were treated as leverage and love as conditional. When I returned home that night, I slept soundly, my mind quiet. The next morning, I received a message from my mother that was brief and cautious. She said she hoped school was going well. I thanked her and left it there. The boundary held without drama. Weeks passed. I settled into a rhythm of work and study that challenged me in ways I welcomed. I found myself thinking less about what I had lost and more about what I was building. The anger faded, replaced by clarity. I did not need my family's validation to know my work mattered. I had evidence in the lives I touched every day and in the skills I was sharpening for the future. One afternoon, a patient I had cared for months earlier returned for a follow-up and recognized me in the hallway. She hugged me and said she would never forget how I made her feel safe when she was terrified. I stood there after she left, feeling grounded in the simplest truth. This was the work. This was the purpose. The rest had been noise. As the semester progressed, I realized the conflict had given me something unexpected. It had taught me to choose direction over approval. I stopped measuring success by how well I kept others comfortable and started measuring it by how faithfully I honored my values. The life I was creating was not flashy or dramatic. It was stable, ethical, and sustainable. On evenings when I studied at my kitchen table, I sometimes thought about the night I pulled over on the freeway, about the instinct to help without calculation. That instinct was still intact. What had changed was my understanding of what help required afterward. Compassion did not mean surrender. Kindness did not require erasure. Justice, when it arrived, had cleared the way for a future built on self-respect. I closed my books, set my alarm for an early shift, and felt content. The story had moved from crisis to continuity, and I was ready for what came next. As the months passed, the rhythm of my life settled into something steady and sustainable. The kind of balance I had never allowed myself to imagine before. Work no longer felt like a place I escaped into to avoid personal conflict. It became one part of a larger structure I was building with intention. I studied in the mornings, worked my shifts, and protected my evenings with a discipline that once would have felt selfish, but now felt necessary. The advanced coursework challenged me in ways bedside nursing never had, forcing me to think beyond immediate care and consider systems prevention and leadership. I realized how much I had underestimated myself simply because others had done it first. At the hospital, the change did not go unnoticed. A physician I had worked with for years commented on how confident I seemed, how clear my recommendations were. I thanked him and moved on, not lingering in the validation, but accepting it as earned. New nurses asked how I managed the workload, and I told them the truth. I said skill mattered, but boundaries mattered more. I said caring deeply did not mean giving endlessly until there was nothing left. Those words felt like a correction I was finally allowed to make out loud. My family remained distant, and while the absence still carried a dull ache, it no longer defined my emotional weather. I stopped checking for messages that did not come. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head. On the rare occasions my parents reached out, the exchanges were polite and contained stripped of the old expectations. I learned that peace did not require closeness. It required respect. One evening, after a particularly long shift, I sat on my balcony watching the city lights flicker on and off like a quiet signal system. I thought about how easily my profession had been dismissed, reduced to something lesser by people who had never stood at a bedside at 3 in the morning. I thought about the sacrifices nurses make without applause. The holidays missed the grief, absorbed the steady presence offered when families fall apart. I felt a renewed pride in belonging to that world. The story that had once tried to define me no longer held power. I was not the nurse who got lucky or the woman whose kindness caused trouble. I was a professional who acted with integrity and learned how to defend it. Mary Ann remained a supportive presence, never intrusive, checking in occasionally to ask about my progress. Her support felt different because it respected distance and autonomy. It reinforced something important. Healthy relationships did not demand access or control. They offered support and stepped back. As my program advanced, I began to imagine future roles not as escapes from nursing, but as extensions of it. Teaching, advocacy, system improvement. The possibilities felt grounded rather than aspirational. They fit the life I was living instead of replacing it. On a quiet Sunday morning, I organized my notes for the week ahead and realized I was not bracing for anything. No conflict, no fallout. Just responsibility and choice. The memory of Christmas night remained, but it no longer carried weight. It had become a reference point rather than a wound. Helping that woman on the roadside had not derailed my life. It had clarified it, and the sacrifices I continued to make were no longer invisible or taken for granted. They were acknowledged first by me. That acknowledgement changed everything. By the time another Christmas approached, my life looked ordinary from the outside, and that ordinariness felt like a victory. I was still living in the same apartment, driving the same car, and working long shifts at the hospital, but the way I moved through my days had changed. I no longer rushed from obligation to obligation, with a sense of quiet resentment humming beneath everything. My schedule was full, but it was mine. I woke early to study before work, made simple meals without guilt, and allowed myself rest without justifying it to anyone. At the hospital, I had settled into a role that carried trust. I coordinated transitions, mentored new staff, and spoke up in meetings without second-guessing whether my voice belonged there. Patients responded to that confidence. Colleagues did too. The respect was not loud or ceremonial, but it was consistent, and that consistency mattered more than applause ever could. My family remained at a distance that felt stable rather than fragile. We exchanged brief messages on birthdays and holidays, polite and restrained. There were no confrontations and no reconciliations, just a mutual understanding that the old dynamics no longer applied. I missed what I once hoped they could be, but I did not miss who I had been when I tried to keep them comfortable at my own expense. That version of me felt far away now. One evening after a shift, I stopped at the same diner where I had taken Marianne weeks earlier, drawn there by memory more than hunger. I sat in a booth by the window watching cars move steadily along the road and thought about how small choices accumulate. The night I pulled over had not been dramatic. There were no witnesses, no expectations, just a decision made in a moment of fatigue and instinct. Yet that decision had forced everything else into focus. It had shown me who respected boundaries and who resented them, who valued compassion and who sought control. It had also shown me my own capacity to adapt without losing myself. As the waitress refilled my coffee, I realized how grounded I felt. There was no sense of waiting for the other shoe to drop, no anxiety about what might be demanded next. The conflict had resolved into clarity, and clarity had given me peace. I paid my bill, stepped back into the cool evening air, and drove home with the windows cracked, letting the city lights blur softly past. At home, I set out my books for the next day and wrote a short list of goals for the coming year. Nothing grand, just steady steps forward. Finish the semester, maintain balance, keep boundaries intact. As I turned off the lights and got into bed, I thought about kindness and justice, about how neither was as simple as stories made them seem. Kindness without boundaries could be exploited. Justice without cruelty could still be firm. The balance between the two was something I had learned to hold carefully. My life was not perfect, but it was honest, and in that honesty I found a sense of security that no amount of approval had ever given me. As the year closed, I understood that the real resolution of my story had never been about money or recognition, but about ownership of my own narrative. For a long time, I had allowed other people to define my value, measuring my worth by how useful I was to their comfort, their image, their sense of control. Nursing had taught me endurance, but it had not taught me permission. What changed after Christmas was not my circumstances so much as my posture. I stopped shrinking to fit expectations that were never built for me. I stopped apologizing for the quiet strength that had carried me through years of sacrifice. The conflict with my family forced that shift in a way nothing else could have, because it removed the illusion that compliance would ever earn respect. I saw clearly that respect begins with boundaries, and that boundaries are a form of care, not rejection. Justice, as it turned out, did not arrive with dramatic speeches or public vindication. It arrived through calm documentation, firm responses, and the willingness to accept distance when closeness required self-betrayal. That kind of justice does not feel triumphant. It feels clean. It clears space. In that space, I was able to make choices that reflected my values rather than my fear. I chose education because growth mattered. I chose rest because sustainability mattered. I chose limited contact because dignity mattered. None of those choices required anyone else to agree. That was the lesson I carried forward. Kindness had been the spark, but clarity was the outcome. I could still help others without surrendering myself to those who misunderstood what help meant. I could still show compassion without inviting entitlement. Those truths felt earned rather than learned, forged under pressure rather than handed down. At work, I continued to advocate for patients and for nurses, speaking up when systems failed and listening when people were afraid. Outside of work, I built a life that felt proportional, where effort was balanced by recovery and responsibility by autonomy. My family remained a distant presence, no longer central, but no longer consuming. I accepted that some relationships cannot survive boundaries because they were built on their absence. That acceptance was not bitterness. It was realism. I did not wish them harm, but I no longer sacrificed myself for the illusion of unity. Looking back, the night I stopped on the freeway stands as a hinge moment, not because of what I gained, but because of what it revealed. It revealed the difference between gratitude and entitlement, between support and control, between love that respects and love that demands. It also revealed my own capacity to respond with integrity under pressure. That mattered most. As I moved forward, I carried those distinctions with me, applying them quietly, consistently, without announcement. My life was not dramatic, it was grounded. I paid my bills, I studied, I worked, I rested. I helped when I could and stepped back when I needed to. That balance felt like justice in its truest form. Not punishment or reward, but alignment. Alignment between who I was and how I lived. In that alignment, there was peace. On the next Christmas morning, I woke before my alarm, the apartment still and quiet, the city outside, wrapped in a pale winter light. I made coffee and stood by the window for a long moment, watching the street below slowly come to life. There were no messages waiting on my phone, demanding explanations, no tension tightening my chest. Just a calm awareness of where I was and how I had arrived there. I thought about that night a year earlier, about the exhaustion in my bones and the instinct that made me pull over when I saw a woman alone on the roadside. At the time, I believed kindness was something you offered and then walked away from. I understand now that kindness often asks more of you afterward. It asks you to protect it from being distorted. It asks you to decide who has access to your life and who does not. I did not regret stopping. I did not regret helping Mary Ann. What I regretted was how long it had taken me to believe that my boundaries deserved the same care I gave others. That lesson had cost me closeness with my family, but it had given me something steadier in return: self-respect. I spent that Christmas simply. I worked a short shift at the hospital, exchanged quiet greetings with colleagues, and cared for patients whose holidays looked nothing like the ones on television. When I came home, I cooked myself a small meal and set my books out for the week ahead. There was no dramatic ending, no reconciliation scene, no apology that tied everything up neatly. Real life rarely offers that. What it offered instead was continuity. I was still a nurse, still learning, still choosing integrity over approval. As evening fell, I thought about the question people often ask when they hear stories like mine. Would I do it again? Would I stop? The answer came easily. Yes, I would stop. I would help. But I would also remember what I learned. That kindness does not require self-erasure. That justice does not need cruelty to be firm. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is draw a line and stand behind it. I turned off the lights, climbed into bed, and felt content. My life was not extraordinary, but it was honest. And in that honesty, I had found something better than praise. I had found peace.